Joe Thompson, an 82-year-old black veteran, reached for the door of the cozy corner cafe, his weathered hands a testament to a life of service. All he wanted was a peaceful Sunday breakfast, a simple pleasure for a man who had fought for his country. But in Ashwood, a town where prejudice simmered beneath the surface of southern hospitality, even scrambled eggs could become a battlefield. As Joe settled into his booth, he couldn't have known that his quiet morning was about to turn into a defining moment in his long and distinguished life. When Frank, the cafe owner, approached Joe with hatred in his eyes and discrimination on his lips, the air crackled with tension. Unbeknownst to both men, a group of rough-looking patrons sat silently in the corner, their presence about to tip the scales of justice in an unexpected direction. But who were these mysterious observers, and how would their silent witness transform into a force for change? Let's find out. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. The small town of Ashwood basked in the warm glow of a lazy Sunday morning, its picturesque storefronts and friendly faces the very image of small-town tranquility. But beneath this idyllic veneer, unseen currents of tension ran deep. Like many towns across America, Ashwood harbored long-standing prejudices and unspoken divisions that simmered just below the surface, tensions that were about to come to a head in a confrontation that would shake the town to its core. In a modest home on the outskirts of town lived Joe, an 82-year-old black veteran. As the early morning light crept through his bedroom window, Joe slowly rose from his bed, his joints creaking in protest. He moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to navigate the world with patience and caution. Joe's weathered face told a story of both pride and hardship. Each wrinkle was a testament to a life fully lived, each line etched by both laughter and sorrow. His dark eyes, though slightly clouded with age, still held a spark of the young man he once was, full of hope and determination. With practiced movements, Joe began his morning routine. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock helping to chase away the last vestiges of sleep. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw not just his present self, but echoes of his past. For a moment, the image in the mirror flickered, and Joe saw himself as a young soldier, back straight, eyes clear, full of idealism, and ready to serve his country. The vision faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Joe to contemplate the stark contrast between his youthful dreams and the reality he now faced. He had served his country with honor, believing that his sacrifice would pave the way for a better future. Yet here he was, decades later, still facing the same prejudices he had hoped to help eradicate. Pushing aside these heavy thoughts, Joe focused on getting ready for the day. He carefully selected his clothes, choosing a pair of neatly pressed slacks and a crisp button-down shirt. But the centerpiece of his outfit was the jacket he reverently removed from its hanger. This wasn't just any jacket. It was adorned with military medals, each one a symbol of Joe's service and sacrifice. As he slipped it on, he felt the weight of those medals, not just their physical presence, but the weight of the memories and experiences they represented. Battles fought, comrades lost, moments of fear and triumph. All were encapsulated in those small pieces of metal and ribbon. Finally, Joe reached for his military cap. As he placed it on his head, adjusting it to sit just right, he was transported back in time once more. In his mind's eye, he saw himself as a young recruit, donning his uniform for the first time. He remembered the swell of pride in his chest, the belief that he was part of something greater than himself. That same pride still lingered, tempered now by years of experience and the harsh realities of a world that hadn't always lived up to his hopes. With a deep breath, Joe straightened his shoulders and headed out the door. Today he was planning to try something new. His usual cafe, a place where he had become a familiar face over the years, was closed for renovations. It was a small disruption to his routine, but Joe decided to see it as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. He had heard whispers around town about another cafe, the Cozy Corner. People spoke of it in glowing terms, praising its home-style cooking and warm atmosphere. The thought of their reportedly famous scrambled eggs, crispy bacon and house-roasted coffee beans made Joe's mouth water. He had always been curious about the place, but had stuck to his familiar haunt out of habit. Today seemed like the perfect day to broaden his horizons. As Joe walked down the street, he nodded politely to those he passed. Some returned his greeting warmly, while others averted their gaze or gave only the barest acknowledgement. Joe had long ago learned to take such reactions in stride, but each small slight still stung, a tiny reminder of the divisions that persisted despite his years of service to his country. Finally, Joe arrived at the cozy corner. The cafe's exterior was inviting, a charming storefront with large windows allowing a glimpse of the warm interior. A hand-painted sign swung gently in the breeze, proclaiming the cozy corner where everyone's welcome. Joe smiled at the sentiment, hoping it would prove true. As he pushed open the door, a bell chimed softly, announcing his arrival. The aroma that greeted him was intoxicating, the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the savory smell of sizzling bacon. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, with soft yellow lights casting a gentle glow over the wooden tables and comfortable booths. The cafe was moderately busy for a Sunday morning. A mix of patrons filled the space, families enjoying a leisurely breakfast, couples engaged in quiet conversation over steaming mugs of coffee, and a few solo diners absorbed in newspapers or books. In one corner, a group of bikers added an unexpected element to the scene. Despite their tough appearance, leather jackets adorned with patches, some sporting impressive beards, there was an air of camaraderie about them. Their laughter rang out occasionally, a boisterous counterpoint to the general murmur of conversation. Joe paused for a moment, taking in the scene. He felt a small flutter of nervousness in his stomach, the kind that often accompanies stepping into unfamiliar territory. But he reminded himself that he had faced far more daunting situations in his life. With a deep breath, he stepped fully into the cafe, ready to experience what the cozy corner had to offer. As Joe made his way into the cafe, he moved with the measured pace of someone who had learned to navigate the world carefully. His eyes scanned the room, an old habit from his military days, taking in every detail of his surroundings. He noticed the worn but well-polished wooden floor, the mismatched chairs that somehow added to the charm of the place, and the local artwork adorning the walls, each piece a window into the soul of Ashwood. A young waitress, her name tag identifying her as Sarah, approached him with a warm smile. Her eyes crinkled at the corners, reminding Joe of his own granddaughter. The resemblance stirred a mix of emotions in him, love for his family, and a touch of sadness at the distance that often separated them. "Good morning, sir," Sarah greeted him cheerfully. "Welcome to the cozy corner. Would you like a table or a spot at the counter?" Joe found himself returning her smile, her friendliness easing some of the tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Good morning," he replied, his voice warm and rich with the wisdom of his years. "A booth would be nice if you have one available." Sarah nodded, gesturing towards a cozy booth near the window. "Right this way, sir. It's a lovely spot. You can watch the town wake up while you enjoy your breakfast." As Joe settled into the booth, he couldn't help but straighten his posture, a habit ingrained from years of military service. The vinyl seat creaked slightly under his weight, a sound that somehow added to the homey atmosphere of the cafe. Sarah placed a menu in front of him, the laminated pages showing signs of frequent use. A good sign, Joe thought, of a well-loved establishment. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" she asked. Joe nodded gratefully. "That would be wonderful, thank you." As Sarah moved away to fetch the coffee, Joe's eyes once again scanned the room, taking in the other patrons. He saw families enjoying their Sunday breakfast, the children's laughter a bright counterpoint to the general murmur of conversation. A few solo diners sat at the counter, newspapers spread out before them as they sipped their coffee. And in the corner, the group of bikers continued their animated conversation, their presence adding an unexpected element to the cozy cafe scene. Joe felt a mixture of caution and hope as he observed his fellow diners. He had lived long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, that a friendly face didn't always guarantee a welcoming heart. But he had also seen enough of the world to know that sometimes humanity could surprise you in the most wonderful ways. As he perused the menu, the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled his nostrils, making his stomach growl in anticipation. The menu boasted a variety of home-style dishes, but Joe's eyes were drawn to the cafe's special: scrambled eggs with crispy bacon and a side of golden hash browns. It sounded perfect. Sarah returned with a steaming mug of coffee, its rich aroma wafting up and filling Joe with a sense of comfort. "Here you go, sir," she said, placing the mug in front of him. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes?" Joe was about to respond when a commotion from the kitchen caught his attention. The swing door burst open, and a man emerged, his bald head glistening under the cafe lights. This, Joe assumed, must be the owner. The man, who appeared to be in his late 40s, had a welcoming expression on his face as he surveyed his domain. His eyes moved from table to table, nodding in greeting to the regulars. But as his gaze fell upon Joe, something changed. The warmth in his eyes cooled, his smile faltering for a moment before being replaced by a frown. Joe felt a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. He had seen that look before, too many times to count. It was a look that said, without words, "You don't belong here." For a moment, Joe considered leaving, avoiding the confrontation he sensed was coming. But a lifetime of standing his ground, of fighting for his right to exist in spaces where others thought he didn't belong, kept him rooted to his seat. He turned back to Sarah, who seemed oblivious to the change in the owner's demeanor. "I think I'll have the special," Joe said, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his chest. "And maybe a side of toast, if that's all right." Sarah jotted down his order with a smile. "Excellent choice. Our scrambled eggs are the talk of the town. I'll get that put in for you right away." As Sarah walked away, Joe took a sip of his coffee, savoring the rich flavor. He tried to focus on the positive, the delicious aroma filling the air, the comfortable booth, the promise of a hearty breakfast. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful Sunday morning was about to be disrupted. The owner, meanwhile, had disappeared back into the kitchen. Joe could hear muffled voices, the tone urgent and slightly heated. He braced himself, knowing from long experience that the calm before the storm was often the hardest part. Sure enough, a few moments later, the kitchen door swung open once more. The owner emerged, his face set in a mask of determination. He made his way directly to Joe's table, each step seeming to increase the tension in the room. Joe took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He had faced down enemy fire, endured the horrors of war, and stood tall in the face of discrimination for decades. Whatever was coming, he would meet it with the dignity and strength that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. As the owner approached, Joe looked up, meeting the man's eyes with a steady gaze. He saw anger there, and beneath it, fear, a combination he had encountered many times before. It was the look of someone confronting their own prejudices, someone who felt threatened by the mere presence of someone different. Joe's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee mug, the warmth of the ceramic grounding him in the moment. He waited, outwardly calm, for the confrontation to begin. The owner, his name tag identifying him as Frank, stopped at Joe's table. His body language was tense, his jaw clenched, as if he were physically restraining himself. The friendly demeanor he had shown to other customers was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his eyes were cold, filled with an unmistakable hostility that made Joe's heart sink. Frank's voice was gruff when he spoke, each word seeming to cost him great effort. "We're full up today. You'll have to leave." Despite his attempt at a commanding tone, there was a slight tremor in his voice, betraying his nervousness beneath the bravado. Joe blinked, momentarily taken aback by the blatant lie. He glanced around the cafe, noting several empty tables and vacant spots at the counter. The confusion he felt must have shown on his face, because Frank's expression hardened further. "I'm sorry," Joe began, his voice calm and measured, "but there seem to be plenty of open seats. Is there a problem?" He met Frank's gaze steadily. years of facing similar situations, allowing him to maintain his composure even as a familiar weariness settled in his bones. Frank's face reddened, his prejudice overriding any sense of business acumen or basic human decency. His voice rose as he insisted, "I said we're full. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The words echoed in the suddenly quiet cafe, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. Joe felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that things had changed more in his lifetime, that the country he had fought for, bled for, would have moved beyond such blatant discrimination. But here he was, decades after his service, still facing the same prejudices he had encountered as a young man. Slowly, deliberately, Joe stood up. His movements were careful, dignified, despite the humiliation burning in his chest. He steadied himself against the table, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear but from the effort of controlling the myriad emotions coursing through him. "Sir," Joe said, his voice low but clear, carrying easily in the hushed cafe, "I'm not looking for any trouble. I just want to have my breakfast like everyone else." There was a patience in his tone, the patience of a man who had faced this situation many times before. But beneath that patience was a note of sadness, a weariness at the realization that some things, it seemed, hadn't changed as much as he'd hoped. Frank's response was immediate and harsh. "Your kind isn't welcome here. This is a respectable establishment." The words hung in the air, shocking in their blatant racism. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. The other patrons finally fully aware of the drama unfolding before them. Joe felt as if he'd been physically struck. The casual cruelty of Frank's words, the ease with which he dismissed Joe's humanity, was a painful reminder of battles Joe had fought both on foreign soil and in his own country. He looked around the cafe, taking in the various reactions of the other customers. Some faces showed shock and disgust at Frank's behavior. Others looked uncomfortable, averting their eyes from the scene. And, Joe noted with a heavy heart, a few nodded in agreement with Frank's words. The divide within the community was laid bare in that moment, a microcosm of the larger struggles still facing the nation. Joe's gaze fell on Sarah, the young waitress who had greeted him so warmly. Her face was a mask of horror, her hand gripping her notepad so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She looked torn, clearly distressed by Frank's behavior, but too afraid of losing her job to speak up. Joe felt a pang of sympathy for her, remembering his own granddaughter and the world she was growing up in. The silence in the cafe was deafening. It seemed as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Joe felt the weight of all those eyes on him, expectations and judgments hanging heavy in the air. In that moment, standing in a cafe he'd hoped would offer a pleasant Sunday breakfast, Joe felt the full weight of his years. He thought of all the times he'd faced similar situations, in diners across the country, in towns both small and large, in the very military he'd served in. He thought of the progress that had been made, the battles won. But he also thought of how much further there was to go, how deeply ingrained these prejudices remained in some hearts. Joe took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He had two choices. He could leave quietly, avoiding further confrontation, but also allowing Frank's bigotry to go unchallenged. Or he could stand his ground, asserting his right to exist in this space, to be treated with the same respect afforded to any other customer. The soldier in him, the man who had fought for his country and for the ideals it claimed to represent, knew there was really only one choice. He would stand his ground. Joe's decision was made in a heartbeat, though to him it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. He wouldn't back down. Not here, not now. He had faced worse in his life and had always stood tall. This moment would be no different. With deliberate movements, Joe reached into his pocket. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of controlling the anger and hurt that threatened to overwhelm him. From his wallet, he pulled out his military ID, the plastic worn but the information still clear. "I've served this country for over 30 years, sir," Joe said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of untold sacrifices and unspoken experiences. As he spoke, Joe's mind flashed back to his years of service. He saw himself as a young man, standing tall in his uniform, full of hope and determination. He remembered the friends he'd made, the battles he'd fought, the losses he'd endured, all for a country that, in moments like these, still seemed to view him as less than equal. Frank, momentarily taken aback by the revelation, quickly tried to regain his hostile demeanor. A flicker of shame crossed his face, quickly replaced by renewed anger. It was as if Joe's service only made him more defensive, more determined to assert his misguided authority. "I don't care what you did," Frank retorted, his voice cracking slightly, revealing the insecurity behind his bigotry. "You're not welcome here. Get out before I call the police." The threat hung in the air, a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play. Joe felt a deep hurt at these words. The dismissal of his service, of the years he'd given to his country, cut deep. He had faced enemy fire, endured the horrors of war, all while believing he was fighting for a better future. And yet, here he stood decades later, still fighting for the simple right to eat breakfast in peace. For a moment, Joe was tempted to argue further, to make Frank and everyone else in the cafe understand the injustice of the situation. The soldier in him wanted to stand his ground, to fight this battle as he had fought so many others. But a lifetime of similar encounters had taught him the futility of trying to change a mind so deeply set in its ways. With a heavy heart, Joe turned to leave. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of this latest indignity bearing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, a few even seemingly satisfied with the outcome. The mixture of reactions was a painful reminder of the divided world he still lived in. As he moved towards the door, Joe's mind raced. He thought of all the progress that had been made in his lifetime, the barriers that had been broken. But moments like these served as stark reminders of how far there was still to go. He thought of his grandchildren, of the world they were inheriting. Would they still have to fight these same battles? The thought filled him with a profound sadness. Just as Joe reached for the door handle, ready to step out into the morning sun and leave this unpleasant encounter behind, a sound broke through the tense silence of the cafe. It was the scraping of chairs against the floor, loud and jarring in the quiet that had fallen over the room. Joe turned, curiosity overcoming his desire to leave. What he saw made him pause, his hand still on the door handle. The group of bikers who had been quietly observing the confrontation from their corner were now on their feet. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard, was making his way towards Joe and Frank. His walk was purposeful, exuding a quiet authority that seemed to command attention. Behind him, the other bikers fell in line, creating an imposing presence that drew all eyes in the cafe. Joe felt a mixture of emotions, surprise at this unexpected development, curiosity about what would happen next, and a touch of apprehension. He had learned long ago not to make assumptions based on appearances, but he couldn't help wondering what these rough-looking men intended to do. The biker leader stopped a few feet away from Joe and Frank. His eyes, sharp and observant, flicked between the two men, assessing the situation. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that demanded attention. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" the biker asked, his gaze settling on Frank. Frank, who had been so confident in his confrontation with Joe, now looked startled and uncertain. His eyes darted around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that his actions had an audience. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead as he visibly grappled with this new development. "This is none of your business," Frank said, trying to maintain his earlier bravado, but failing to keep the nervousness out of his voice. "It's between me and him." He gestured vaguely towards Joe, taking a small step back as he did so. Joe remained where he was, his hand still on the door handle. He was poised between leaving and staying, curious to see how this unexpected intervention would unfold. His years of experience had taught him to be cautious, but something about the biker's demeanor made him pause. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted. The earlier tension was still present, but now it was tinged with a sense of anticipation. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The simple act of getting breakfast had turned into something much more significant, a moment that felt like it could tip in any direction. As Joe stood there, caught between the door and this unfolding scene, he couldn't help but reflect on the unpredictability of life. He had walked into this cafe expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, and now found himself at the center of a confrontation that seemed to embody the larger struggles of society. He watched as the biker leader stood his ground, a calm presence in the face of Frank's agitation. In that moment, Joe felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, he thought, there were still surprises to be had in this world. Perhaps support could come from unexpected quarters. With that thought, Joe let his hand fall from the door handle. He turned fully to face the scene before him, ready to see how this unexpected chapter in his long life would unfold. The biker leader's calm demeanor seemed to unnerve Frank even further. The cafe owner's earlier bravado was crumbling, replaced by a nervous energy that was palpable to everyone in the room. Frank's eyes darted between Joe, the bikers, and the other patrons, as if seeking an ally or an escape route. The biker leader, however, remained focused on the situation at hand. His voice, when he spoke again, was measured but firm. "We couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he said, his eyes never leaving Frank. "And we have a few things to say about it." Frank, his face now a mixture of anger and fear, attempted to reassert his authority. "This is my establishment," he sputtered, his voice rising. "I have the right to serve who I want." The biker leader nodded slowly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both understanding and disagreement. "You're right. This is your establishment," he conceded, "but rights come with responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is to treat all people with respect and dignity." As he spoke, the biker reached into his leather jacket. Frank flinched, clearly expecting the worst, but what the biker pulled out was not a weapon, but a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a card and held it up for all to see. It was a military ID, similar to the one Joe had shown earlier. "You see," the biker continued, his voice taking on a new depth of emotion, "many of us here are veterans too. We've served alongside men and women of all races, creeds, and backgrounds. We've bled together, fought together, mourned together." A murmur ran through the cafe as the implications of his words sank in. Joe felt a surge of emotion, surprise, gratitude, and a renewed sense of camaraderie that he hadn't experienced in years. The biker leader wasn't finished. He gestured to his companions, and one by one they stepped forward. Some showed military IDs of their own, others rolled up sleeves to reveal military tattoos. Each of them stood tall, their faces a mixture of pride in their service and anger at the injustice they had witnessed. One of the bikers, a black man with graying temples, stepped up beside his leader. His eyes blazed with controlled anger as he faced Frank. "We fought alongside men of all colors," he stated firmly, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cafe. "Your prejudice has no place here. It has no place anywhere." Frank, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, became even more defensive. His face contorted, fear and hatred warring in his expression. He looked around wildly, seeking support from the other patrons, but found only averted gazes and disapproving looks. "This is my cafe," Frank shouted, his voice rising to a near-hysterical pitch. "I have the right to serve who I want." Spittle flew from his mouth in his agitation, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The biker leader remained calm in the face of Frank's outburst. "And we have the right to take our business elsewhere," he replied evenly. "But first you owe this man an apology." He gestured towards Joe, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Frank, however, was beyond reason. The confrontation had pushed him past his breaking point, and his next words came out in a rush of anger and fear. "Get out!" he yelled, his face red with rage. "All of you. This is my place, and I decide who stays." The biker leader, who had introduced himself as Mike, fixed Frank with a steady gaze. "You'll bitterly regret this," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a promise. There was no heat in his words, no threat of violence, but rather the certainty of consequences to come. Joe, who had been silent throughout this exchange, felt a whirlwind of emotions. He was touched by the unexpected support, amazed at the turn of events, but also concerned about the escalating situation. As much as he appreciated the bikers standing up for him, he didn't want the situation to devolve into violence. Mike, seeming to sense Joe's unease, turned to him with a reassuring nod. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "We have our own ways of settling things." The other bikers nodded in agreement, a sense of purpose evident in their expressions. With that, Mike gestured to his group, and they began to file out of the cafe. As they passed Joe, each of them nodded respectfully or offered a word of support. Joe felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by this unexpected show of solidarity. As the last of the bikers left, the cafe erupted into a buzz of conversation. Some patrons were leaving, clearly uncomfortable with what had transpired. Others were engaged in heated discussions, the morning's events having stirred up strong feelings. Frank, his face still flushed with anger, retreated to the kitchen without another word. Sarah, the young waitress, approached Joe hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your breakfast is on the house if you still want it." Joe looked at her kind face, then at the chaotic scene in the cafe. Despite his hunger, he no longer had any appetite. "Thank you, but I think I'll be going," he said gently. "It's been quite a morning." As Joe stepped out of the cafe and into the bright morning sunlight, he found himself surrounded by the group of bikers. The contrast between the tense atmosphere inside the cafe and the open air outside was stark, and Joe felt as if he could breathe freely for the first time since he'd entered the cozy corner. Mike, the biker leader, approached Joe with a look of concern on his weathered face. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. Joe nodded, still processing the events that had just transpired. "I'm fine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to thank you all. You didn't have to do that." The bikers gathered around Joe, forming a protective circle. Their leather jackets gleamed in the sunlight, patches and pins telling stories of their own journeys and battles. Joe found himself surrounded by a group of men who, just an hour ago, he might have been wary of. Now he saw them as unexpected allies. Mike placed a hand on Joe's shoulder, the gesture both comforting and respectful. "We always stand up for our own," he said firmly. "No veteran should ever be treated the way you were in there. It goes against everything we fought for." Joe felt a lump form in his throat. He'd spent so many years feeling like he was fighting these battles alone, and now, out of nowhere, he had found a group of people willing to stand beside him. It was overwhelming. "I appreciate that more than you know," Joe said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I have to ask, what did you mean when you told Frank he'd bitterly regret this? I don't want any violence. I've seen enough of that in my lifetime." Mike's expression softened, understanding in his eyes. "Don't worry," he reassured Joe. "We have our own ways of settling things. No violence, I promise you that. We're long past those days." The other bikers nodded in agreement, a sense of purpose evident in their expressions. Joe looked from face to face, seeing determination and a shared sense of injustice in their eyes. These men, he realized, had probably faced their own battles with prejudice and misunderstanding. They knew all too well the sting of being judged based on appearance alone. "What do you have in mind?" Joe asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Mike smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Let's just say we know how to make our presence felt without raising a fist. Frank's about to learn that his actions have consequences, and those consequences can hit him where it really hurts. His business." Joe felt a mix of emotions wash over him. He was grateful for the support, touched by the bikers' willingness to stand up for him, but he also felt a twinge of concern. He didn't want to be the cause of more conflict in the town. "I appreciate what you're doing," Joe said carefully, "but I don't want to make things worse. This town, it's got its problems, but it's still my home." Mike nodded, understanding. "We're not here to cause trouble, Joe. We're here to make things right. Sometimes that means shaking things up a little, but trust me, we know what we're doing." As they talked, Joe couldn't help but marvel at the unexpected turn his morning had taken. He'd walked into that cafe feeling alone, and now he stood surrounded by a group of men who were ready to fight for his dignity. It was a powerful reminder that support could come from the most unexpected places. "Thank you," Joe said again, his voice filled with sincerity. "All of you. It means more than you know." The bikers responded with nods and words of support. There was a sense of solidarity in the air, a shared understanding of the battles they had all fought, both on foreign soil and here at home. As the group began to disperse, Mike turned to Joe one last time. "We'll be around," he said. "If you need anything, just let us know. And don't worry about Frank or the cafe. We'll make sure justice is served in our own way." With that, the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life in a chorus of power and freedom. Joe watched as they rode off, their leather jackets and chrome gleaming in the morning sun. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, Joe found himself standing alone on the sidewalk, the events of the morning still swirling in his mind. He began his walk home, his steps slow and thoughtful. The peaceful Sunday morning he had anticipated had turned into something entirely unexpected. But as he walked, Joe felt a glimmer of hope that he hadn't felt in years. Perhaps change was possible, even in a small town like Ashwood. Perhaps there were more allies out there than he had realized. As he reached his house, Joe paused on the porch, looking back in the direction of the cafe. He couldn't help but wonder what the coming days would bring. With a deep breath, he entered his home, ready to reflect on the morning's events and prepare for whatever might come next. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the sun rising over Ashwood as if nothing had changed. But for Joe, everything felt different. The events of the previous day had shaken him, bringing both pain and an unexpected sense of hope. Joe rose early, as was his habit. As he went through his morning routine, his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation at the cozy corner. He thought about Frank's hateful words, but also about the unexpected support from Mike and his group of bikers. It was a stark reminder that both cruelty and kindness could come from unexpected sources. After a simple breakfast at home, Joe decided to take a walk into town. He told himself it was just to buy a newspaper from the kiosk near the cafe, but deep down, he knew he was curious to see if anything had changed overnight. As he approached the center of town, everything seemed normal at first. The usual morning bustle was in full swing, with people hurrying to work or running errands. But as Joe neared the cozy corner, he noticed something out of the ordinary. A crowd had gathered in front of the cafe, much larger than the usual morning rush. As he got closer, Joe's eyes widened in surprise. Parked in front of the cafe was a line of motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. And standing in front of them, forming a human barrier to the cafe's entrance, were dozens of bikers. Joe counted quickly. There were over 50 of them, far more than had been present the day before. They stood silently, their presence both imposing and peaceful. Many wore jackets with military insignia, a silent testament to their service and solidarity. The scene was surreal. The quiet, small-town street had been transformed into a stage for a powerful statement. Passers-by stopped to stare, some taking photos with their phones, others whispering among themselves. The contrast between the peaceful morning and the imposing sight of the bikers was striking. As Joe took in the scene, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of vindication, seeing such a strong response to the injustice he had faced. But there was also concern about the impact this would have on the town, and a touch of worry about potential backlash. While Joe stood there trying to process what he was seeing, he noticed Mike emerging from the group of bikers. The leader spotted Joe and made his way over, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Good morning, Joe," Mike greeted him, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Joe nodded, still somewhat at a loss for words. I didn't expect this," he finally managed to say. "When you said you had your own ways, I never imagined—" Mike chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "We bikers know a thing or two about making a statement, and we take care of our own. What happened to you yesterday? That's not just your fight. It's ours too." As they spoke, Joe noticed movement at the cafe's entrance. Frank had emerged, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "What is this?" he sputtered, looking around wildly. "You can't do this. I'll call the police." Mike turned to Frank, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Go ahead," he said evenly. "We're not breaking any laws. We're just a group of veterans who decided to visit a local cafe." Frank's face reddened even further, if that was possible. He stormed back into the cafe, the door slamming behind him. Through the window, Joe could see him frantically dialing on his phone. "He's calling the police," Joe observed, a note of worry in his voice. Mike nodded, seemingly unperturbed. "Let him. We're not doing anything illegal. We're just making a point." Sure enough, within minutes the sound of police sirens filled the air. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and officers emerged, looking both confused and cautious at the scene before them. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples, approached Mike. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone professional but wary. Mike stepped forward, his manner respectful but firm. "Good morning, officer," he said. "We're just a group of veterans who heard about an incident of discrimination at this establishment yesterday. We're here to peacefully protest and show our support for our fellow veteran." He gestured towards Joe. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he recognized Joe. "Mr. Thompson," he said, nodding in greeting, "is this true? Were you discriminated against here?" Joe stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew his words could have a significant impact on what happened next. "Yes, officer," he said clearly. "Yesterday I was refused service and told to leave, solely because of the color of my skin." A hush fell over the crowd as Joe spoke. Even those who had just been passing by stopped to listen. Joe could see a mix of reactions on the faces around him: shock, anger, shame, and in some cases, uncomfortable recognition. The officer nodded gravely, then turned back to Mike. "And this demonstration is your response?" "Yes, sir," Mike confirmed. "We're here peacefully. We're not blocking the sidewalk or preventing anyone from entering. We're simply making our presence known." The officer seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "As long as you remain peaceful and don't obstruct business or pedestrian traffic, you're within your rights to be here." As the officer turned to leave, Frank burst out of the cafe again, his face a picture of disbelief. "You're just going to let them stay?" he demanded. "They're ruining my business." The officer fixed Frank with a stern look. "Sir, they have the right to peaceful protest. If what Mr. Thompson says is true, you might want to consider the real reason your business is suffering." With that, he returned to his patrol car, leaving Frank sputtering on the sidewalk. As the morning wore on, more and more people gathered. Some were simply curious onlookers, but others began to join the protest. Joe saw several of his neighbors arrive, expressing their support and outrage at how he had been treated. Local news vans began to arrive, reporters eager to cover the unfolding story. Joe watched as Mike calmly explained the situation to them. His words measured but powerful as he recounted the previous day's events and emphasized the need for change. As Joe stood there, watching the scene unfold, he felt a profound sense of change in the air. What had started as a painful incident of discrimination had transformed into something much larger, a moment of community reckoning, a chance for Ashwood to confront its hidden prejudices and perhaps begin to heal. He couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things had escalated. Just yesterday, he had walked into the cozy corner hoping for a quiet breakfast. Now he found himself at the center of a movement that seemed poised to shake the very foundations of his small town. The days that followed the bikers' protest were a whirlwind of activity in Ashwood. The small town, usually so quiet and set in its ways, found itself thrust into the spotlight. News vans became a common sight on Main Street, reporters eager to cover the unfolding story of discrimination and community response. For Frank, the owner of the cozy corner, the consequences of his actions were swift and severe. The image of dozens of bikers peacefully protesting outside his cafe had made national news, bringing unwanted attention to his discriminatory practices. In the weeks that followed, Frank's business crumbled under the weight of the scandal and the ongoing boycott. The once bustling cafe now stood mostly empty, a stark contrast to its formerly busy state. Through the large front windows, passers-by could see Frank inside, looking dejected and defeated. The cheerful clinking of coffee cups and the aroma of freshly baked goods were replaced by an eerie silence and the stale smell of a space unused. Joe, who occasionally walked past the cafe on his daily strolls, couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was a sense of justice being served, but also a sadness at seeing a once thriving local business reduced to this. He reminded himself that this was the consequence of Frank's own actions, not something he had sought or desired. As the boycott entered its third week, a new development arose. Mike and his biker group, seeing an opportunity to effect real change in the community, approached Frank with an offer to buy the cafe. Joe was present when Mike presented the offer, having been invited by the biker leader to witness this pivotal moment. They stood in the nearly empty cafe, the silence broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional car passing outside. Mike's expression was serious as he faced Frank across one of the cafe's tables. "It's time for a change," he said firmly, sliding a document across to Frank. "We're offering to buy the cozy corner from you. Fair market value, despite the current situation." Frank's hand shook as he reached for the paper, his eyes darting between Mike and Joe. The once confident cafe owner now looked like a shadow of his former self. Weeks of public scrutiny and financial stress had taken their toll, etching deep lines into his face and adding a noticeable tremor to his movements. "Why?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you want this place after everything that's happened?" Mike leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Because we believe in second chances, but we also believe in consequences. This town needs a place where everyone is truly welcome. We aim to make that happen." Joe watched as Frank studied the offer, emotions playing across his face: relief, shame, resignation. After what seemed like an eternity, Frank picked up a pen and with a shaking hand signed the document. As Frank's pen scratched across the paper, Joe felt as if he was witnessing more than just a business transaction. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. A cafe that had been a site of discrimination was now being transformed into a beacon of inclusivity. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with news of the change in ownership. Mike and his team worked tirelessly to renovate the space, transforming it both physically and symbolically. The old sign for the Cozy Corner came down, replaced by a new one reading Patch and Stripe Café, a nod to both the biker and veteran communities. The grand reopening of the cafe was a community event. People from all walks of life in Ashwood turned out to see the transformed space. The new Patch and Stripe Café was warm and inviting, with walls adorned with photos celebrating diversity, in the military, in the biker community, and in the town itself. Joe was given the honor of being the first customer. As he entered the cafe, he was struck by the changes. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, filled with the chatter of a diverse group of patrons. He saw young families, elderly couples, and yes, a group of bikers, all sharing the space comfortably. Mike greeted Joe with a warm handshake, leading him to a seat at the counter, the very spot where he had faced discrimination weeks before. "What do you think, Joe?" Mike asked, gesturing around the bustling cafe. Joe took a moment to absorb the scene around him. He saw Sarah, the young waitress from before, now working with a smile on her face, free from the tension of the past. He saw new faces behind the counter, a diverse staff that reflected the community's makeup. "It's more than I ever could have imagined," Joe replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've turned something painful into something beautiful." Mike nodded, a look of satisfaction on his face. "That's what we do, Joe. We take the ugly things in life and we rebuild them, make them better. It's what we did in the service, and it's what we're doing here." As the day wore on, the cafe bustled with activity. The grand reopening had drawn people from all walks of life in Ashwood, creating a vibrant atmosphere that was worlds away from the tension of just a few weeks ago. Joe watched the diverse crowd with a sense of wonder. Families, elderly couples, groups of friends, and yes, several bikers, all shared the space comfortably, their laughter and chatter filling the air. As he observed the scene, Joe noticed a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, approach a table where an elderly black couple was seated. The boy's parents watched nervously from nearby, but their anxiety turned to surprise and joy as they witnessed what happened next. The young boy, with all the innocence of youth, struck up a conversation with the couple. Joe couldn't hear the words, but he saw the smiles that bloomed on the faces of both the couple and the child. It was a small moment, but it represented something much larger: the breaking down of barriers, the fostering of understanding across generations and races. Mike, who had been chatting with other patrons, returned to his seat next to Joe. He followed Joe's gaze to the heartwarming scene. "Now that," Mike said softly, "that's what it's all about." Joe nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. The simple interaction he'd just witnessed seemed to embody everything they had been fighting for. As they sat there, Sarah approached with a fresh pot of coffee. Joe noticed a small pin on her apron that read, "Equality serves everyone." It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about the changes that had taken place. "Refill, Mr. Thompson?" Sarah asked with a warm smile. Joe nodded, holding out his mug. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with gratitude that went beyond the coffee. "And please call me Joe." Sarah's smile widened. "You got it, Joe," she replied before moving on to the next customer. Mike raised his mug, gesturing for Joe to do the same. "What do you say we make a toast, Joe?" Joe raised his own mug, curious. "What are we toasting to?" Mike's eyes swept across the cafe before settling back on Joe. "To unexpected friendships," he began. "To standing up for what's right. To second chances and new beginnings." "And to a future where everyone feels welcome," Joe added, his voice soft but firm. Their mugs clinked together, the sound ringing out clearly even amidst the cafe's chatter. It was a small moment, just 2 men sharing coffee and conversation, but it represented something much larger: the power of community, the strength found in unity, and the change that can happen when people come together to stand against injustice. As Joe looked around the bustling cafe once more, he felt a profound sense of hope. The Patch and Stripe Cafe had become more than just a place to get coffee and breakfast. It was a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, a symbol of the positive change that can come from even the darkest moments. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of solidarity and community transformation. If this story of standing up against injustice touched your heart as much as it did ours, I've handpicked another inspiring tale I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it next.